Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm doing a special show today because Bob Wheeler made a video that I had some questions about, and I wanted to invite him on to talk about. But Bob was not able to do a show on a Saturday when I have my regular time. So I set this up to do a special show just to accommodate Bob's schedule. Welcome, Bob.
Well, thank you. Hi.
Bob, tell us a little bit about yourself, about your channel, and what it is that you are trying to do with your work.
Oh, well, I have a pretty long and varied history, and you got a couple hours? Uh, I was raised in the Syracuse, New York area in a suburban neighborhood, and was raised in a fundamentalist Baptist church. Um, Went off to college, had to drop out after a couple of years and served time in the military. Did tours of duty in Vietnam and Germany, and then went to a Mennonite college once I got out of the service. And then I went to a seminary after that, and I got a 2-year degree there, although I never actually went into the ministry for a variety of reasons. And had a pretty rich and varied work career. I've worked in blue-collar jobs and white-collar jobs. I've worked in private industry. I work with the state. Currently, of course, I'm 75 years old now. So during the tax season, I do taxes as a tax preparer, paid tax preparer. And I've lived in, like I said, I grew up in a suburban neighborhood. And as we were talking about a few minutes ago, I lived in a couple of inner city neighborhoods in Philadelphia for several years. And now I live in a very rural area in north central Pennsylvania.
Okay, very good, very good. Okay, now your channel is called the Berean Observer.
Berean Observer.
And what is that all about?
Well, I guess it's basically an apologetics YouTube channel. Actually, I used to do blogging for years, and I had a blog at one time called the Berean Observer, and I cover a wide variety of topics and so on. But I sort of figured that YouTube's kind of like the marketplace of ideas, and so I just sort of felt that this is where I should probably use the gifts and abilities that I have.
Okay. Now, the video that caught my attention, you talk about a couple of different things. It was creation versus evolution, but the portion that I was particularly interested in was your interpretation of creation. Now, you are not a young Earth creationist; you are an old Earth creationist.
Correct.
But I had some questions about your timeline, so I'll let you first explain what your timeline is.
Oh, well, basically, well, let me explain. Let me back up a little bit here. This probably isn't going to directly answer your question, but when you're faced with an apparent problem, a contradiction between science and scripture, you have to ask yourself some pretty basic questions. And one of the things you have to ask is, what are the facts, the bare facts, and how do we know what we know? So when you come to the age of the Earth, I don't know. Are you able to bring back up the picture that I gave you that you used it for the advertisers of the rock cliff? Can you bring that up?
Let's see. I turned it into a slide, so I'm not sure if I kept. I still have the original picture in my email, but I'll have to down. So you keep talking, and I'll pull it up.
Okay, all right. Well, basically, what it is up here in north central Pennsylvania, where I live, I live on what's called the Allegheny Plateau, and it has a lot of deep valleys cut into it, and we have a number of exposed rock cliffs. Okay, and the one that I gave you in the picture is one of them, and I parked my car in front of the cliff so you could actually get a view of an idea of the immensity of it, and of course, when you're actually standing in front of one of these cliffs, you're impressed by the sheer size of the whole thing. And I began to realize that when you look at that, there's no way that all those sedimentary rock layers could have been laid down in the course of just a single flood disaster. So that the Earth really does have to be old. And of course, since then I found out that the dinosaurs were wiped out when a comet or an asteroid struck the Yucatan Peninsula, and they call that got it written down here, They call that the paleogenic extinction event. And yeah, there it is right there.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at the picture carefully, you'll notice that there are multiple layers of sedimentary rock, which means they could have all been laid down in just a single flood event that lasted less than a year.
Okay, but that really isn't what I wanted to ask you about because I'm not a young earther either, and
Right.
I think young Earth is just to the point of being silliness.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I have some questions about your timeline,
Sure.
your views.
Uh-huh.
So, in your view, um, the first thing that happened was God created the heavens and the earth, correct?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then, in your view, the K2 extinction event occurs next?
Well, no. What happened? Well, uh, maybe millions of years. It's hard to say.
Well,
Um,
yeah,
yeah.
a million-year gap, and
Right.
then
Right.
that's the
Right.
next
I
thing.
should explain that perhaps I know that when you were talking with Kip Davis, that he was criticizing Dr. Michael Strauss,
Mhm,
if I recall
mhm,
correctly. And if
yeah,
I understand what you said in that video, that Strauss is taking the day age theory.
mhm,
Right. So in other words, when you're taking a look at the geological evidence and you're comparing it with what's in Genesis 1, then you get this question, well, how do you interpret Genesis 1? All
mhm,
right. And so one way of doing it, of course, is to talk about young Earth creationism. Okay, which I just said I don't hold to. So then if you hold to an old Earth, then the question is, how do you interpret Genesis 1? Now, one common way to do that, and I gather that's the way Michael Strauss does it, is called the day age theory, where supposedly each of the 6 days represents a different geological age. Okay. What I hold to is what's sometimes referred to as the gap theory.
yeah,
All
yeah,
right.
mhm,
So that basically what it boils down to is this. You take a look at Genesis chapter 1. Okay.
mhm,
And verse 1, and I'm going to read this from the New American Standard Version. Verse 1 just simply makes a simple statement. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the way I interpret that is just a very, very general statement that introduces the subject. Okay. Then you go down to verse 2, and it says the way they translated it here. The earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters. Now,
mhm,
what I'm arguing is that there was a gap between verses 1 and 2, and
mhm.
that verse 2 is probably a very accurate description of what the world looked like right after the KT extinction event.
Okay, okay.
So, and it was interesting because there was, I don't know if you're familiar with the old Schofield Reference Bible.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
I have one.
Okay. Well, if you look at the footnotes on page 1,
Mhm,
it actually says the earth had undergone a cataclysmic change as a result of divine judgment. The face of the earth bears everywhere the marks of such a catastrophe. And then he goes on to suggest the possibility that basically the angels had fallen first, and that God had tested them and they fell. Because you got to figure that when God,
so they were thrown down to the earth, and that was the meteorite?
well, the meteorite was the result of apparently the disobedience of the angels. Now that's kind of speculative, okay, but what we do know for the fact is that the dinosaurs were wiped out when the meteorite hit
And
the earth.
that's where I run into a problem because
Hmm.
the dinosaurs are animals, right?
Right.
And the animals don't get created until what, verse 14?
Well,
No,
no,
even
no,
later than that.
no. What I'm arguing is that what happens is that when you come down to verse 3, okay,
Mhm.
in the text, then what happens is that God starts the creation process all over again. So, in
Oh,
other
so
words, yeah,
God created animals and plants and everything, and then he destroyed it in the K2 event, and then he
right,
started all over
right,
again.
right. And part of it is that I think there's a common mistranslation in verse 2 where it
Mhm,
says the earth was formless and void.
mhm,
And the Hebrew phrase that's used there is tohu vavohu. And it's the same phrase that's used in a passage in Jeremiah chapter 4, which describes the desolation of the land of Palestine. And so the New American Standard Version has a marginal reading where they call it waste and emptiness. So I think what happened was that the earth was functioning, and you had all this wildlife, including all the dinosaurs and so on. And
Mm-hmm.
then apparently, for some reason or other, God decided to destroy it. Schofield thought it was because the angels had fallen in sin and it was a judgment on them. I think well, of course, we don't know that for a fact.
Mm-hmm.
I think one possibility is that God might have had the idea to create human beings, and he knew that human beings couldn't coexist with dinosaurs. So he sent the asteroid to wipe out the dinosaurs, and then he started the creation process all over again. So basically, what we're seeing today is
So your God isn't omniscient.
well, now that is a tricky theological problem.
Well, because if he had not decided to create humans until after these things, then
Hmm.
he wouldn't have known that he was going to create humans from the beginning.
Well, let's put it this way. I know that theologians argue and philosophers argue and debate about that question altogether. And
Hmm.
but I'm very hesitant to get involved with that. And the reason why is because you got to figure that God is infinite and I'm not.
Why?
Okay. Why am I not infinite?
No, 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 no. That's not the question at all.
Uh-huh.
The question is, why do you have to think that?
That God is infinite?
Yeah.
Well, what I would say this is that I could tell just by looking at creation that whoever made all that out there is far wiser and far more brilliant than I am.
Okay, now wait a minute. Why do you assume that someone made it?
Well, that's where we get into the whole question about the theory of evolution. But basically, I would argue from the
Wait, no, no, we're not
yeah,
getting into evolution at all
okay,
because there's no life yet.
right,
We're just working on the
right.
planets. That's
Well,
not
what I
evolution.
I basically argue from design. The old watchmaker argument. I'm sure you've heard of that before.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And the fine tuning of the universe. So I take a look at it. In fact, sometimes I tell people the proof for the existence of God is literally as plain as the nose on your face. Because when I look
So
at your
basically, it's you feel like it.
no, no, when I look at your face, it looks like it's symmetrical to me. And I always get atheists that come back and say, "Oh no, my face isn't symmetrical." And, gee, well, sorry to hear
What
about
difference
that.
does it make whether my face is symmetrical or not?
Well, the idea then is that there's a structure, okay, and an
Right.
order
It's
to the
called the
universe.
brain line division, a central brain line division.
Right, right, right. Well, I mean, your whole body is symmetrical, for the
That's
most
because
part.
of the central brain line division.
Okay. So where did the
I
symmetry
know a
come from?
woman who had a child with no central brain line division,
Really?
and he was not symmetrical.
Yeah. Well, yeah, but
He did
something like,
not live.
oh,
That is
yeah,
incompatible with life.
sure, sure, absolutely. But most human beings and most animals do have symmetrical, faces. And so you take a look at your hand. Let me put it to you this way. I remember one time years ago, I was sitting with my family we were having a little lunch in a little convenience store. And at the next table over, there was a guy that had an artificial leg. All
Mhm.
right. And it was kind of a clumsy thing, with the cables and the pulleys and the whole 9 yards. And I'm sitting there thinking to myself, according to an evolutionist, the artificial leg, the clumsy leg with the cables and the pulleys, that was designed. That was made by our intelligent design. Whereas the
Right.
perfectly natural, normal leg happened about through a completely blind, impersonal, natural process.
Right. Mhm.
Yeah, which I have a hard time accepting.
Okay. Well, I
Okay,
understand you because it is not
right,
intuitive. It is not intuitive. But
right.
if the only reason for believing in God is it's intuitive, then we really don't have a reason to believe in God.
Well, no, I mean, I realize, I mean, it's just, it kind of give you an idea, just through practical experience. I mean, I'm not a scientist, okay?
Mhm.
But I
And
remember,
I'm not either.
okay. I remember one time for a while there, for a number of years, I was working in a warehouse, okay? So
Mhm.
let's say, for example, I had to count the number of bolts in a given box. So I dumped the bolts out on the table, and they're just a chaotic mess, just a messy pile, okay? So then I start counting them, and I put them in nice, neat little piles of 10 bolts each, okay? And I had them all arranged, in a square, okay? That's the result of, intelligent design. Several other times I've worked for the Census Bureau, okay? You walk up to a house and the lawn is mowed, you figure somebody lives there. You can tell the difference between a mowed lawn and a not mowed lawn, right?
Yeah. But
Okay.
okay, weirdo community known as Evan brings up a really good point. Goodness knows nothing can ever even be even vaguely symmetrical through natural processes. It's not like it happens all the time in nature and is actually quite intuitive. And he's obviously being facetious here because take a snowflake, for example. Snowflakes are
Right.
not designed. Nobody chose how each, portion, and yet they're all symmetrical. Flowers are perfectly natural, and yet they're symmetrical. Yeah, all these things in nature are symmetrical, even though no one is standing there with a pen or a screwdriver or a lawnmower and
Hmm.
making them that way.
Right. But then where do the laws of nature itself come to? Okay.
Well, obviously they're natural.
Right. They're natural.
That's why we
So,
call them
yeah.
laws of nature.
Right. So, yeah, if you go to my YouTube channel, boy, probably way back last January or whatever, I did a couple of different videos on atheism. And what I pointed out is that once you remove God from the picture, you typically wind up with two diametrically opposed atheistic worldviews. So one of them is the more scientific approach, naturalistic
Mhm.
materialism, where you argue that the only thing that exists is physical matter. Everything conforms to unchangeable laws of nature. There's an endless chain of causality, which means that right now I'm basically carrying on a conversation with a hunk of protoplasm.
Well, technically you are.
But I think you're
I
more than
mean,
just that.
well, yeah, obviously.
Right.
Obviously. But that's why I said technically you are. And if you want to go to that, technically you could say I'm driving a pile of metal and plastic and fabric when I go and get in my car and drive my car because
Right.
that's what it's made up of. But just
Right.
as the car is more than the sum of its parts,
Right.
we are more than the sum of our parts as well.
Right. Exactly. Okay. So then the opposing opposite worldview would be kind of the more postmodern, the existentialist postmodern worldview that argues that we exist as autonomous beings inside an impersonal universe, and therefore we're free to define ourselves any way we want to. And I'm sure you're familiar with Simone de Beauvoir and her book, The Second Sex.
No, I'm not. Sorry.
Really?
No.
A feminist like yourself has never read Simone de Beauvoir?
Nope.
Oh my goodness.
I haven't been an atheist for very long. I was in the Christian bubble for 42 years.
Okay.
And while I was in the Christian bubble, I was led to believe that if someone wasn't starting from a theistic viewpoint, that whatever they had to say wasn't worth reading. And so I only read things that were written
Um,
by Christian authors.
well, I have quite a library, and so I basically, and of course, I was a history major as an undergraduate. Okay,
Mhm.
so I'm interested in whatever it is that's influenced society.
Okay.
So one of the things I
I'm
was interested.
currently working my way through Atlas Shrugged.
Oh, okay, all right. Well, basically, so yeah, I've got the works of Friedrich Nietzsche, for example, and so on.
Mhm.
And so when you get into what it was, is the Simone de Beauvoir. She was a very intelligent lady, and she was a close friend and companion of Jean-Paul Sartre. And
Okay.
I might be mispronouncing the French names and everything. So she basically was very, very influenced by Sartre's existentialism. Okay, but she's looking at, so then she's taking into consideration the condition of a woman in modern society in the light of Sartre's existentialism. Okay, and what she
Mhm.
came with, the conclusion that she came to is the gender roles are totally artificial and patriarchal. They're man-made, and that a woman needs to get liberated by freeing herself from throwing off all these man-made gender roles. Okay,
Mhm.
so basically, the book she wrote, The Second Sex, is like the Bible of the feminist movement. Okay, and she goes through and discusses that. Now, the problem with her argument is that what's good for the goose is good for the, or what's good for the gander, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Okay,
Mhm.
so if the woman doesn't have to conform to any kind of a preconceived gender role, why
Mhm.
should a man?
Right, and that's exactly where we are
Exactly.
today. Mhm.
Exactly where we're at today. And so we
Mhm.
should wind up with social confusion, basically. in the breakdown of the family structure.
I wouldn't call it that. I would call it social freedom. That people can live whatever gender they feel or whatever gender they wish.
Right. But what does that do to the institution of marriage and the family structure?
Doesn't
And
do
this,
anything to it.
oh,
It
you
has no
don't,
effect on it whatsoever. I
oh,
mean, I have a daughter who has who is a doctor, and her husband is a
mm-hmm.
stay-at-home father.
Well, this is
And
where, yeah, go ahead.
there's nothing wrong with her marriage. There's nothing wrong with her child.
Okay. But basically, this is where my own personal experience of living back in an inner city neighborhood in Philadelphia comes in, crime-ridden streets. And what you'll find is that back in those days, the African American community had been plagued for generations with single-parent families. And it's because of the unfortunate legacy of slavery. And now we're getting into the situation where practically all of American society is that way. So as a tax preparer, one of the questions I run into, when somebody wants to claim a dependent, then one of the questions I have to ask is, well, can anyone else claim this person a dependent? And the
Mhm,
answers I get, well, he doesn't have any contact with them, and that kind of a thing. And what
mhm.
really, really worries me are the boys and the young men that are growing up into these dysfunctional single parent families, and they have little or no contact with their biological fathers. And I think they're the ones that are going to wind up being prone to a kind of a neo-Nazism that have very warped views of masculinity.
This is going down a path I definitely do not wish to tread because it can
Okay,
be extremely racist.
right.
Um, I do not hold to the view that, Black people are more prone to crime than other people, and I'm not gonna tolerate that. Let's go back to the topic that we said we were gonna talk about,
Okay,
which is your creationist timeline.
yeah,
Okay, so in your view, God creates the world and
right.
the plants and the animals and the
Hmm.
sun and the stars and everything,
Hmm.
and then, it goes on for a few million years,
Hmm.
and then he throws the angels down to earth, which causes the K2 extinction event and kills about 80% of the life on earth.
Well, I don't know if
That
they actually threw angels down. That was Schofield's position.
Okay,
Okay.
okay.
But we do know that for some reason or other, the asteroid hit the Earth and wiped out. Basically, it brought an end to the Mesozoic era. And so then I would argue that what you see here in Genesis 1 is the reconstruction of the Earth and the beginning of what we call Cenozoic life.
Okay. So when the language of Genesis 1 says God created, he's not really creating because the earth is already there. He's not creating the plants, they're already there. He's not creating the animals, they're already there.
No, no. What happened was is that in Genesis 1:1, the very first verse, it says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." So that would be way at the very, very beginning of existence. Okay.
Mhm.
And then life went on like that. And basically, see what it is, and you want to keep in mind too, and I think going back to the Kev Davis's discussion in the video that I saw this morning again.
Mhm.
Um, I would want to argue that, and of course, he would want to argue that, well, whoever the author of Genesis 1 was is working with a primitive, ancient cosmology and so on.
Right.
Okay.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
basically, what I'm arguing, and I'm kind of looking at from a literary standpoint, I kind of half agree with him that basically the purpose of the Bible is not to go into technical detail about how physics and cosmology work, but basically it's to describe God's interactions with the human race. So the story begins basically with the creation of the human race, which begins in verse 3. Well, actually, in the sixth day. So what happens then is what happened before the KT extinction event is kind of irrelevant for theological purposes, and you know all we have that is that brief description of verse 2 where it says, "The earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the water, moving over the surface of the waters."
Mhm.
So my argument is that that's what the earth looked like right after the KT extinction event.
Okay. First, let's go to this question. The question
Okay.
asked if you oops, I have the wrong one. Question asked if you have a PhD.
No, I don't. No.
Okay. I didn't think you did, but I didn't
Yeah,
want
the
to.
highest degree I have is a Master of Arts in Religion degree.
Okay. 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 Now getting back to the text. So in the text, then in Genesis 3, when it says, let there be light, God doesn't really mean that he's creating light because the light's already there.
Right, exactly. And I know that's a possible interpretive problem there. But basically, what we know from the KT extinction event was that where did I got the information down here? Just a second here. That basically what happened was that atmospheric particles blocked the sunlight, and there was a dust cloud that darkened the sky. And from what I understand, going to like Wikipedia and so on, is that um, at the maximum it lasted for a few weeks, and then it didn't completely go away for a couple of years. And they say it actually stopped photosynthesis of plants. So what happened was is that right after the asteroid hit, the sky was completely blacked out. Now, the sun was still there. You just couldn't see it. So then the question is, when you go down in the text and it says that on the fifth day or so that God created the sun and the moon and so on. Um, you know, Kip Davis could argue that, well, that's not really true. That basically the sun was already there, and the answer is true. But what I'm saying is that the way this is described, again, the purpose of Genesis 1 is not to go into a technical detail, scientific explanation of how the universe works. So what it does is it explains things from the way it would look like from the standpoint of an ordinary human being standing on the ground and looking up in the sky. So at first,
So
the sky was
God didn't
blacked out.
really
So it's like,
create it. It just kind of made it look like that.
well, what happened was that, yeah, I mean, he created it when he sent the asteroid down and it blocked out the sky. And then what happened was that on the first day, the the dust particles in the atmosphere start to fall away, and so the sky starts to light up, but you still couldn't see any heavenly bodies. So that's what things look like. So when it says God said, "Let there be light," that's what it looked like. And it wasn't until several days later that the disk clouds further disintegrated, and then you could actually start to see the sun and the moon and the stars.
I see that as completely destroying the creation story. I mean, it's not a creation story anymore. It's a God kind of letting people know what's coming story. And when he says, let there be light, he didn't create anything. He didn't reveal anything. He didn't clear up anything. He just letting them know in a week or so there's going to be some light here.
Well, no, because what happened was is that's where you go back to verse 1, which you have this very, very broad, general statement. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In the beginning would have been like way back before the Paleozoic era.
Okay. But the
Okay.
problem with that, and this is where Kip Davis comes in, and I can play the segment if you need me to, is that the language that is used for create in verse 1 and
Mm-hmm.
the language that is used in verses 3 and 6 and so forth all are using the same word for create. They are all saying that God created. It's not that God created in verse 1 and in these other verses he's just kind of letting people know what's going on.
Actually, he used two different words, and I think Kip mentioned that. In verse 1, it uses the verb bara, okay, which almost always refers to something that God did, and it would have the idea of bringing something out of nothing. And the other word, and Kip made a big point of this about the meaning of the word asa.
Mhm.
Okay, you might remember that. And he tries to argue that it just basically means that you create something that didn't exist before. But Hebrew words can have a pretty broad range of meaning. And the word asa has a very, very broad range of meaning. It can mean you do something, do justice, or use the word asa, for something like that. And again, I'm saying that like for literary purposes, as it were. God's explaining all of this to finite human beings who have no idea of, the solar system and, the planets and that kind of a thing.
Mhm.
And so they tended to think that the earth was flat, and that there's a rakia, a firmament, okay,
Mhm.
in the sky. And just the way it looked from the ground. Okay, it's not necessarily saying that that's actually the way the atmosphere looks. Okay, And so basically the sun was always there from way back millions and millions of years before that, when the dinosaurs roamed the earth. So
Mm-hmm.
then the sun got blocked out in the KT extinction event, and then as the dust began to settle, it reappeared. And
Right.
so from the standpoint of a human being, a human observer on the ground, oh, look at that. I never saw that before. That's the sun. So that's why he would use the word asa.
Okay. Now what about the plants? Is he creating the plants or is he revealing them by pulling back the dust from the K2 event?
Well, apparently, from what I understand, in the K2 event, because the sky was darkened out for a couple of years, supposedly photosynthesis had stopped. So,
It
of
couldn't
course,
have
again,
stopped altogether
yeah,
because
yeah,
there were still animals on the earth the entire time. It didn't kill everything on the face of the
right.
earth.
This is well, yeah, that's the theory, and I have no way of knowing,
Mhm.
because I wasn't there back then, But I know it's common to think that basically the KT extinction event wiped out 75% or 80% of the life,
Right.
and
Mhm.
so presumably, at least the theory would go that there were species that managed to survive, and then they
Right.
promised that.
Mhm.
But they
Mhm.
also wind up saying that basically the photosynthesis stopped for a couple of years because the sky was blacked out and there wasn't any light. So
That doesn't make sense because if photosynthesis stopped for a couple of years, there'd be no oxygen on the earth.
that's possible. Yeah, I'm not an expert on those things, so that's just what I've read. Okay, from secular sources. Wikipedia might have gotten it all wrong.
Yeah, I think so because yeah, I'm looking at one thing. It says photosynthesis did not completely stop after the KPG extinction event, although it was severely disrupted. This
Hmm.
event, which occurred approximately 66 million years ago, is believed to have been caused by a massive asteroid impact and so on.
Hmm.
But it couldn't possibly have destroyed all of photosynthesis for a year because there'd be no oxygen.
Well, whether it did or not, the point I would want to make is that after the asteroid, after the KPG extinction event, that
Hmm.
that basically God started over again. Now, did he have to start over completely from scratch because there was nothing that survived it, or was it just in basically disarray and the process of reconstruction began, but there might have still been some species that somehow managed to survive? I think it's kind of irrelevant for the story. Basically, the story is the Cenozoic life as we know it today was created by God after the KPG extinction event.
Okay. So basically, while during this year that everything is dark,
Hmm.
the plants all die.
That's what the scientists are telling me. I don't know.
Okay. Okay. So when the verse tells you that God created plants, you don't know if God is actually creating plants or if God is just kind of revealing plants that are already there.
Well, again, I'm not like a biologist or a paleontologist, so I
Well,
couldn't
I'm
tell you.
asking about your Bible interpretation. I'm not asking you about the science.
Well, yeah, but what I'm saying is that what we're trying to do is to kind of reconcile the Bible with science. Okay, so
Hmm.
you're asking me, was it all destroyed? Well, were there plant species that survived the KPG extinction event? Or did they all get wiped out? Uh, were there species before the KPG? Was there plant species in the Mesozoic era that survived into the Cenozoic era? Are we talking about a whole new species of plant life? I really don't know. I'm not an expert in those things.
Hmm. So the Bible means whatever the scientists discover. If we discover that plants existed, then what God did was reveal the plants. And if we discover that plants didn't exist, then that means God created them. So what the Bible means changes with what we discover in science.
Well, to a certain extent, I probably wouldn't want to go as far as Kev Davis did because he seems to want to make um, the account in Genesis, just a piece of ancient cosmology. He tries to argue at one point that
Mythology,
yeah,
not
mythology.
cosmology,
Well,
mythology.
the cosmology, and but he relates it to mythology, and whereas I'm arguing that the purpose of the text is not to give
Mhm.
us a technical, detailed, scientific explanation of exactly what happened physically. Okay, it's
Okay.
basically just describing how the world that we live in today took form.
Okay, so basically, when someone reads the Bible, it really is meaningless as to the creation story because if we don't have the scientific evidence to support what it means, we really can't know what it means.
Well, no, I would say that basically it is describing it. It's just not doing it in technical detail. So, in other words, so it is describing, the creation of vegetation and plants and animals and so on. And so the point that the text is making is that we live in that basically the world we live in today was created by an intelligent supreme being, and basically everything was meant to function that way. And if
But
there's
that's not
ultimate,
what you're
and if
saying the
there's,
story
and
said.
if God's ultimate goal was to create human beings, He then had to recreate the world so that it was inhabitable by humans, and so you had to have plant and animal life.
Okay. Are human beings a special creation?
Yes.
Okay. So human beings did not evolve from other life forms such as other apes.
Not from apes, no. They had,
Okay.
in fact, I was taking a look at what you said in, I don't know if there was Kip's the video there. You did
No, it
talk
wasn't
about,
because I didn't talk with Kip about human evolution. That's not
yeah,
his field.
but it looked like, let me see here. You did talk about Homo erectus and Neanderthals and
Mhm,
Denisovans. Was that in
mhm.
his video or the other one you did? I know there was another
It
one I
was
looked at.
probably in a different one because, like I said, I don't think I talked
Yeah,
to him about that.
yeah,
It's possible that did, but I don't think I did.
yeah. So,
We
what
have
did,
Denisovan DNA in our DNA. I mean, there's no question that humans and Denisovans interbred.
okay, all right. Yeah, and then of course, when you look at the text of Scripture itself, you get into Genesis chapter 6, and it talks about the angels mating with the daughters of men, and that there were these Nephilim, and
Mhm.
who knows exactly what they were. So, I mean, trying to trace down the exact genetic heritage, of human beings, um, again, it's
But we
my
have the
level.
human genome. We've already done that.
Well, okay,
In fact, it was a creationist that
all right,
headed the Human Genome Project,
okay, all right.
and theoretically asks a very good question. If we didn't evolve from apes, then why are we still apes?
Well, again, you see, I'd be a little bit skeptical about that. And again, I'm not a biologist, and I'm not a geneticist, but you got to figure that if God makes a wide variety of plants and animals, and some of the plants, for example, are similar to each other, they're going to have a genetic makeup that's going to be similar to each other. Okay. So even if you compare us with an ape, a lot of the genetics are going to look very, very similar. Does that prove that somehow we evolved from apes? I would argue no, and that's where you get into the whole business about evolution.
Well, that's when you go into ERVs, disogynous retroviruses. And I didn't say that correctly. Somebody in the chat correct me. I didn't say that quite right. But anyway,
I think
yeah,
microevolution.
that's
Yeah.
further than I really wanted to go into the science.
Okay. All right. Okay.
Hablo, let's see if I can pronounce
Hablando
it.
con Moy.
Yeah, ask, have you seen Gutsick Gibbon? And that's a very good question. Have you?
No, I don't even know what it is.
Oh, Gutsick Gibbon is a channel, is a YouTube channel.
Oh,
She is a fourth year PhD paleontology candidate.
okay.
She's about to get her PhD in human. Thank you, Geo Sam. I was and Mage Grey Wolf, endogenous retroviruses. I knew I was saying it wrong because it
Mm-hmm.
was, but uh, she her expertise is
Mm-hmm.
human evolution and primate paleontology.
Okay.
Um, and she's done a lot of videos on, busting young earth creationism. And again, I understand you're not a young earth creationist,
Right.
but she also recently did a debate, and it's a 5-hour video with Jerry. Let's see, what was his name again? He is a creationist, and by the end of the video, or by the end of the debate, he conceded not that humans are are evolved from apes. I'm sure he would not concede that, but he did concede that Lucy was bipedal, because the evidence for it is just so strong. Bergman, that was it. Bergman.
Okay. Not familiar with him.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, the main questions I had was, if the Bible means basically whatever we want it to mean, and the meaning of the words change with our scientific discoveries, really, what's the purpose of it? I mean, not the whole Bible, but what's the purpose of the creation story if it really, means whatever we kind of meaning we put to it?
Well, I firmly believe in the principle of sola scriptura. Okay, I believe that the Bible is a revelation from God, and that's what we have to go by. And we have to interpret it as honestly as possible and ask ourselves, what did the human author actually think he meant when he wrote what he wrote? Okay. And so, yeah, for the most part, I take the Bible quite literally. Now, when you come to a passage like Genesis chapter 1, of course, and you get into this, like I say, the intent of the inspired text was not to
Mhm.
give a detailed technical explanation about exactly how everything works physically and came into existence. The idea is to establish the fact that God created the universe. He's the creator. He created human beings in his image, and he structured the world in such a way that it could sustain human life.
Okay.
I think you could argue that I would argue for like describing a 6-day process there. I know a lot of people like whoever it was, Stewart was his name? I forget. Um, Michael Strauss, seemed to hold to a day age theory. The
Hmm.
problem I have with that is that the way the text is set up, it seems to divine. It talks about the movement of the celestial bodies, and that defines a day as evening and morning. So the text itself pretty much describes a day, the way it's used in that particular text, as a more or less 24-hour period.
But
And of
you
course,
don't think it means that?
well, no, I do.
Oh, you do think it means that?
Yes, yes, I do.
But you also said that when God said, "Let there be light," that it took several days or weeks or months or even years for the light to appear. So there couldn't have been evening and morning the second day or the third day, whichever it was, the day that the sun's created, if it happens over a process that occurs over, a year or two.
Well, that's just it. You don't know. You can't. I mean, it's impossible for us to know exactly how long after the asteroid actually struck the Yucatan Peninsula before God actually said, "Let there be light."
So God would wait until the light was almost completely clear and then say that, "Let there be light," so that the next day the light would be full.
Yeah.
Well, that sounds rather silly, because
Well,
people are already seeing a lot of the light. They can see the lights there. And so God's saying, "Let there be light." And the person's like, "Well, duh, I can see the light. What do you mean, let
well,
there be light?"
no, there weren't any persons then at that particular point in the creation narrative,
Okay. But if
right?
if this is supposed to be explaining the narrative in such a way that it would be uh, to be understood by a person who's hearing the story, and the person who's hearing the story is being told that, okay, the sun was in the sky, and this event happened to cover the sun,
Hmm.
and as the cloud was starting to dissipate, when it was almost completely finished, then God said, "Let there be light." And that was God. What's God doing other than declaring, "Yep, that's what's going on"? There's no creation going on there.
Well, again, you get into a technical, metaphysical question about, God's control over nature and, how actively involved in the way nature works and so on. Ultimately, he's the ultimate cause of all these things. How it works out in actual practice is beyond me.
Okay. Okay. Do you believe that there was a literal global flood?
Oh my! I was afraid you were going to ask that question. That's I'm still looking into that. The I think that of course there were one thing about it is that there were flood narratives that you find in a number of ancient peoples in India, for
That's
example.
true, and
Right,
that's
right, right,
because
right,
most ancient civilizations were near water because people need water to survive.
right, right.
And wherever
Exactly.
you're near a
Right.
waterway, there's going to be flooding.
And one thing that's interesting, if I would date the flood, probably about the middle of the third millennium BC. And the thing about it is that you don't, yes.
I'm just calculating. I'm wondering, is that before or after the building of the first pyramid? Because that's one of the
Well,
problems with the Answers in Genesis timeline, is
right,
there were pyramids in Egypt before the date that they put for their
right,
flood, and there's no flood damage on the pyramids.
right. But from what I understand, we don't have any. There were obviously human beings. There were obviously there were human beings living in the Paleolithic era. Okay, and we know there were cavemen who with stones and so on. But as far as like any civilization of which we have written records that have come down
Mhm.
to us, which would be the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians, would be the oldest ones. They
Don't forget
probably
the
all,
Chinese and the,
yeah, you're talking,
Aztecs and there were civilizations in India. In 3000 BC, there were civilizations all over the earth, not just in that one
uh,
region.
there may have been physical relics of civilizations that could have gone back before that. But in terms of anything that we have written records that have come down to us, basically
That's
Egypt and
true. There's
Mesopotamia, yeah, Egypt and Mesopotamia are the earliest ones. And they will date back to like maybe the first half of the third millennium
But we
BC.
definitely have art, and we have, pottery, and we have, um, architecture from
Yes,
civilizations from other areas.
yes, we do.
Mhm.
And the whole idea then is that the flood destroyed those civilizations.
And they were all re-inhabited by Babylonians?
Well, that's where you get into the tricky question about the migration of different ethnic groups, around the globe and so on.
Okay, but according to the flood story, there is only one ethnic group 100 years after the flood. According to the Bible, all of the people were living at Babel until God dispersed them.
Right.
And so all of the people on the face of the earth were all Babylonians when the migration starts.
But their languages were confused.
Right, but they are
Right.
still Babylonians. They would still have Babylonian pottery, they would still have Babylonian art styles, they would still have Babylonian architecture. And that is not what we find.
Yeah,
We do not find Chinese civilizations being destroyed and being replaced by Babylonian ones. We don't find Aztec civilizations being destroyed and being replaced by Babylonian ones.
I'm not so sure that the Aztecs and the Mayans went back before that. That's what I'm trying to look into, try to get a little
Uh-huh.
bit better
Uh-huh.
history of, like the Stonehenge. When was the Stonehenge built? I don't
I
really
don't know.
know. Yeah,
I don't know.
neither do I. And so then you get the question too that, I mean, obviously the
But
purpose of,
even Egypt,
Mhm.
the Egyptian culture wasn't wiped out and replaced by Babylonian culture. The pyramids that were built in Egypt post your flood era
Yeah,
are very similar to the pyramids that were built pre your flood era. It
okay.
wasn't it they didn't change to a
Yeah,
different people
right,
group.
right. So anyway, to get back to your original question, one of the things I'm trying to find out is how widespread around the face of the globe was human civilization before the flood?
I've looked into that, and there were at least 7 known civilizations, and one was in India, one was in China, one was in South America, and I don't know if they were Aztecs or Mayans, but I do know that there was a
Right,
civilization in South America.
right. So if there was a civilization back then, and you might be right, like I say, I'm still working into it, then got a bug that flew in my eye. Then, of course, if in order to destroy the human civilization, God would have to wipe out the flood would have to cover the whole earth. On the other hand, if civilization was largely confined to Europe and the Middle East and Eastern Southern Asia, then it's quite possible you had only just a partial flood.
Right. Okay. So that's why I asked if you held to a global flood or not. So you're not sure whether the flood was global or local.
Right. Still looking into it.
Okay. So what the Bible means depends again on what we find in history and science.
Well, not no. What the Bible means is what the original Bible authors intended. Okay. Um, and again, you have to keep in mind, again, it's the Hebrew language the words have a very broad meaning. So, for example, when it says that the flood covered the earth, it would be the Hebrew word eretz. All right, but the
Mm-hmm.
Hebrew word eretz can have a lot of different meanings. Okay, it could refer to the entire inhabited earth. Sometimes it could refer to just a particular geographical location, like we talk about Eretz Yisrael. It's just a place where that's just the land of Israel.
Okay.
See?
Do you believe that there's a God that wants people to know him and understand him?
Yes.
Why would a God that wants people to know him and understand him leave us with a book as our only information source about him that is so open to interpretation that we can't tell what it means by creation, what it means by the flood, what he's doing or not doing, where we came from, did God create us or did we evolve? If we have so little information about this God, what you know, how could he possibly expect us to believe in him?
Well, I mean, obviously the gospel is rooted in the New Testament, and I do believe I'm very critical of some of the higher critical methods. I think that the four gospels do give us an accurate record of what the historical Jesus actually said and did, and over 10,000 denominations.
Yeah, that's what
Yeah,
I'm going to ask you next as a result of your response. Yeah.
yeah. I know I'm fascinated by church history, and I think one of the things that's kind of interesting is how an infinite, eternal God an omnipotent God could use finite mortal human beings to accomplish his purposes here on history. And so I'm
And,
kind of sympathetic with the complaint. Of course, I'm very fascinated by the reformers and so on. And
mhm.
so you have a situation where I'll give you an example here, and this might be a little bit off the topic, but Martin Luther, of course, was started off as a Catholic monk. And as he studied the New Testament, especially the Paul's epistles, he came to the conclusion that you're justified by faith. In order for you to be made righteous in the sight of God, you personally have to exercise faith in Jesus Christ as your personal Savior. Now, the problem is he was working within the context of a state church to practice infant baptism. So now what do you do? As Søren Kierkegaard pointed out a couple of centuries later, are we going to say that somebody's a Christian just because he was born in Denmark and he was baptized as an infant? See, so there's like a conflict there. And yet, if Luther gave up on the idea of a state church, he likely would have wound up beheaded, burned at the stake like John Huss. So you get the same thing with John Calvin. John Calvin's working within what had happened, you go back to Switzerland with Ulrich Zwingli, okay? And Zwingli was, doing expository preaching. He's going through the Bible and expounding it, chapter and verse. And he had some young followers, and the young followers realized, wait a minute, where do you see infant baptism in the New Testament? It doesn't make any sense at all. And at first, Zwingli was sort of sympathetic. And then when he realized, no, if you give up on infant baptism, you just give up on the idea of Switzerland being a Christian country. And so he had to revert back to the idea that you could have a state church that practices infant baptism. And his young followers wound up becoming Anabaptists, and they wound up getting persecuted. And I guess as someone who eventually graduated from a Mennonite college, I think the Anabaptists were right. If you take a look at the way the church life is described in the New Testament, it's not a state church, okay? It's a brotherhood of believers who share a mystical union with Christ, and they demonstrate that by showing love toward one another and living lives in nonconformity to the surrounding world.
Does God hate Asian people?
No.
The number one factor for determining what religion a person is where they are born. And the people least likely to be Christians because of where they are born are Asian people. So if there is a God that cares about people knowing him and believing in him, why does he make so many people be born in Asia where the chances of them coming to know him or knowing anything about him are extremely low?
Well, that gets us into a debate about Calvinism and predestination. You want to go there?
Are you a Calvinist?
Well, I'm reluctant to call myself a Calvinist because we're warned against putting a human leader on a pedestal. Okay, I'm not going to believe something just because John Calvin had it. But if you're talking about the so-called 5 points of Calvinism, I probably be considered like a 4.5 point Calvinist.
Okay, so let me ask you this, because this is the question that I ask every Calvinist.
Okay.
If you were to find out that God did not choose one of your children to be one of the elect, and one of your children has been predestined to hell, are you okay with that?
No, and in fact, you're probably familiar with Leighton Flowers.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and I think at one time he commented on a video that you did where you
Yes.
interviewed a Calvinist, right? And the guy
Yes.
said, "Yeah, I'm okay with it." And I would,
Yeah. And I told him, don't ever let your children see this video. And he
right.
did not get why that was such a
Oh,
problem.
gee, yeah. No, I mean, Jesus himself wept over the city of Jerusalem because of its unbelief. Okay, and there are passages that says that God is not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to eternal life.
Well, then why is he making people that he's predestined to hell?
Well, that's where you got to be a little bit careful. Okay, I think you had toward the end of the 16th century and into the 17th century, you had like what was called scholasticism, like Reformed scholasticism, where you
Mm-hmm.
had these theologians who were relying very, very heavily on human logic. So the argument would go something like this: if God is sovereign and omnipotent, then that means he always does exactly what he wanted to do. So if he doesn't save everyone, then therefore he doesn't want to save everyone. So then you have like a Puritan theologian like John Owen. Have you ever heard of John Owen before? An English Puritan?
I'm not familiar with him.
Okay. He wrote a book on the death of death and the death of Christ, as it's called it. It's an elaborate treatise on the atonement. Okay.
Okay.
And so then he tries to explain away John 3:16.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And what I'm saying is, again, I believe that the Bible is the inspired word of God. And so you have to deal with it as honestly as you possibly can. And you have to realize that, there are some things that are going to be left mysterious, that God has to reveal to us. Yeah. Some of these theologians would wind up trying to psychoanalyze the mind of God, which we're not in a position to do. Okay. So there are passages, a number of passages that talk about, how that God, doesn't.
Oh, wait a minute. Wait a minute. Why not? I mean, if we are supposed to love and trust this God and turn our lives over to him and have complete faith in him, but we're not allowed to ask what his character is. If we
Well,
are not allowed to examine his character, then we have no business having faith in him.
well, no, because we're dependent on him to tell us. He's got to reveal us. And there are passages of scripture that talk about the definitive passage there is in Exodus chapter 32, when God is talking to Moses on Mount Sinai and a cloud passes before him. And then God makes this definitive statement about his moral character, which then gets repeated, throughout the Old Testament. And basically what it indicates, and the thing about it is that God is both a God of love and compassion and mercy, okay? But he's also a God of justice. And we're told specifically in Romans chapter 1 that the wrath of God is revealed against all the unrighteousness and ungodliness of men. Okay, who
But
suppress the truth and unrighteousness.
doesn't Romans also tell you that some are created for destruction and to be vessels of wrath?
I'm not sure if that's a Romans 1.
No,
Okay.
not Romans 1. I think it's Romans 5. Let me check. But there's definitely a verse that
Right.
tells us that some are created as vessels of wrath.
Right. That's in
And
Romans 9, the famous
yeah. Okay.
controversial passage in Romans 9. And what he's doing there is he's talking about the problem that Paul's dealing with there in Romans 9 through 11. Here he is, he's from a Jewish background, he's a Christian, he's now a missionary to the Gentiles, and he's traveling around. He would go to the Jewish community first, and then he would wind up getting rejected by the Jewish community. So the theological problem is, if the Israelites are God's chosen people, why are they rejecting their promised Messiah? And so that's where he goes into this elaborate discussion of Romans chapters 9 through 11. Okay. And it is true that in that sense, God does have a sovereign purpose where the only people who can come to Christ are persons in whose lives he, convicts through the power of the Holy Spirit. And he doesn't do that to everyone. So there are some people that are reprobates where God just passes them by and lets them stay in their sin. And then there's other people where he reaches down and he pulls them out of the gutter and he saves them.
Okay, but the people that he passes by is the vast majority of humanity, correct?
Quite possible. I know there was, I think it was
Well,
maybe.
we know that
Yeah.
no more than a third of the earth is Christian.
I think it was, yeah, that's true. And
So the vast majority of the earth are being passed by, and God doesn't care one whit about them. Good to hell with them,
no, I wouldn't
literally.
say, well, yeah, he did send them to hell. I think, have you ever heard of B.B. Warfield?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
If I'm not mistaken, B.B. Warfield made the comment that if somebody dies before the age of accountability, they go to heaven. And because the infant mortality rate back then was so high, he argued that the majority of human beings actually do wind up going to heaven. The infant mortality rate, of course, has come down now.
Well, if that's true, then abortion is the best thing that people can do.
Well, that's up to God to do. Okay.
Okay, and also, I've been waiting for the Christian that was going to make this comment to me that it's better for children to die. I have lost a child. Are you trying to tell me that when my child died, I should have rejoiced because that's the best thing that could have happened to her?
Well, no, because there's an emotional bond there.
Well, isn't there an emotional bond to every child? Isn't it absurd to say that it's a good thing for children to die?
No. I mean, obviously, the fact that death even exists at all is a part of the tragedy of the fall. And the fact that any human being has to die is a tragedy.
Then why is God making so many people that not only die, but they have to face a second death and they have to face torture for eternity? That to me is the ultimate evil, to create a being that you know is going to be tortured for eternity.
Well, I'm a little reluctant to say exactly what happens to everybody that winds up going to hell and dies as an adult. But the fact of the matter is, the passage I was going to read you in the end of 1 Corinthians chapter 1. Okay. Paul's writing to the church at Corinth and so on. And he's warning them against putting people like John Calvin and so on up on a pedestal. And he says, for consider your calling, brethren, that there were not many wise according to the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble. But God has chosen the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. And God has chosen the weak things of the world to shame the things which are strong. And the base things of the world and the despised God has chosen, the things that are not, so that he may nullify the things that are, so that no man may boast before God. But by his doing you are in Christ Jesus, who became to us wisdom from God and righteousness and sanctification and redemption, so that just as is written, let him who boast in the Lord. Okay. So if I ask myself, even now, I see people that are like physically disabled or mentally disabled. And I say to myself, there, but for the grace of God go I. Why did God chose me to make me the way I am and chose me to save me so I'm in good health and I've got a good education and I can conduct discussions here with godless granny, okay? And there are other people out there that are mentally retarded, you see. It's just God's pure grace that he showed toward me. It's not because I deserved it at all.
Okay. Now, you don't know everything about God, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And you do not know every point of theology, correct?
No, I don't.
Okay. So if you were to die and you come before God and he says, "Sorry, you didn't get the theology correct. I know you believed, but you didn't believe the right way. You're
Hmm.
going to hell." Not only
Well,
what do you think?
no. That's where you get into the whole question of justification by faith. And the idea, and this is what Martin
But
Luther
can a
realized.
person have a faith in anything?
No, 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 no. This is what Martin Luther realized. Okay, that basically you're made righteous in the sight of God by an imputed righteousness. In other words, Jesus Christ was the only perfect sacrifice for sin. So he dies on the cross. Okay, and what happens then is that so then you personally have to put your trust in Christ in order to have your
How do
sins.
you know? Maybe it's all a cosmic joke. You know, you don't know the mind of God. Maybe it was all a big
Well,
joke, and
no,
the joke's on
this
you that
is
you're
this
living by a faith that
this
doesn't
is
exist.
this is what Paul says in his epistle to the
Well, so
Romans.
what? Maybe, you know what, that's part of the cosmic joke.
Well, uh,
And as Dr. Andy points out, aren't there irreconcilable contradictions in the Bible, like Judas' death, the birth narrative, the dates of Jesus' death, the resurrection, and so on? It's still the Word of God.
well, yeah, actually, believe it or not, I am not actually a formal member of a church, and part of the reason why is because the church I tend to, you'd have to subscribe to the statement of faith
Mhm,
in order to be a member of the church. And one of the things that the statement of faith says is that you have to believe that the Bible is inerrant in the original writings.
mhm,
And I am aware that there are, minor contradictions. Why did why did Matthew quote a passage from Zechariah and say it was Jeremiah? You know,
mhm,
did
mhm,
Jesus tell his disciples to take a staff, or did he tell them not to take a staff? That
mhm,
kind of a thing. There's a passage in Hebrews 11 that says that what was it? I think Jacob was resting on his couch when he blessed his sons, whereas no, it says he was resting on his staff when he blessed his sons, and then you go back to the original text in Genesis, and it says he was resting on his staff. Well, you run into a lot of little, you run into little translation problems and so on,
mhm,
where you run into problems like that. So, and then when you take a look at how the Bible itself actually describes the process of revelation, what it is that God communicates verbally with inspired prophets and apostles, and then the human being takes that revelation, he commits it to writing. And in the case of somebody like Jeremiah, for example, he receives the revelation, but it's Baruch who actually puts it down and commits it to writing. Now, does the Bible say that the Holy Spirit was so controlling Baruch, was he's writing it down on paper, that he was incapable of making a single mistake whatsoever? That's why it's hard for me to say that the Bible is inerrant, because that means not one single mistake of any kind whatsoever, no matter how minor or trivial. I think again, with B.B. Warfield, said he didn't like to use the word inerrant either, and he used the example of the Wicked Bible. You ever hear of the Wicked Bible?
mhm, mhm. Yep, the one where adultery, thou shalt commit adultery.
Yes.
Mhm.
Accidentally left the word not out of the seventh commandment.
Yep. Okay, well, we are out of time. We had talked, beforehand that we were gonna hold this to about an hour, and we've gone a little bit over, and that's
Okay.
okay. But, I think that's probably enough because I know that, like I said, I don't like to watch anything that's more than about an hour long.
Right.
But Bob, thank you so much for coming. I've appreciated your candor. I've appreciated your being willing to share in an environment where your views are not exactly well received.
And I want to thank you as a YouTuber for not using artificial intelligence to make your videos. That just absolutely drives me up the wall.
Mm. Well, you are most welcome. And I
Yeah,
do want to let my viewers know that on Saturday, I will have on Dr. Richard Carrier and Bill Cluck. Bill Cluck has recently converted from atheism to theism based on the fine tuning argument of Luke Barnes.
mhm.
And Dr. Carrier had recently done a blog dismantling the fine-tuning argument by Luke Barnes. And so that's going to be an interesting show.
It sounds like it.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much for coming, Bob. I appreciate your time.
Okay, you're welcome.
Live your life.